Hi, good morning. Welcome everybody to the daily shir of the Rambam, 3 chapters per day. Lesson 154, the rules of Hilchos Bias Hamikdash from chapter 2 until chapter 4. In Divine Providence, the first halachos of the beginning of our lesson of today are very much tied and connected to Inyan Adiyayim, to the day that we are about to mark, the holiest day of the year. And say Inyan Adiyayim, Tarte Mashma. The word Yoimo in Hebrew means Yoimo, the day. And there is an entire tractate in the Talmud that deals with the rules and all aspects of Yom Kippur, which is also called the Maseches Yumo. And right, the first halacha is about the limitation in time, in space, and also in the soul. The holiest place, which is called the Kodesh HaKadoshim, is designated to entry only to the high priest and only on Yom Kippurim and only throughout the frames of his service 4 times throughout the day. Any deviation from those limits is associated with heavenly death, and that's far as goes to the Kodesh HaKadoshim. As far as the entry to the Kodesh, which is to the chamber or to the Azore, not for the purpose of avodo, so the oynesh that is associated with that is love, is only malchus. The same way it is forbidden to the kohanim, to the priest, to enter to those areas where they are not supposed to enter, they have a prohibition to exit from the place and the time of service. So if a priest is leaving the services while it is being done, he is again subject to misobedei shomayim. The only time then where he is allowed, and in fact he's supposed to stop his service, is when he heard that some of the relatives that he must engage in mourning over them, then he is not allowed to service anymore. The only exception to this exception, which means the only priest who must continue to work even though there is some of his relatives have died, is the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, that he is working while he is in a state of aninus. Aninus is oinen, and the definition of oinen is divided into both biblically and rabbinically. Biblically is the day when his relative died. Rabbinically, the extension of that period goes until the moment that this relative is being buried. Until the point of burial, he will be considered a oinen. So a Kohen Gadol is the only exception where he actually can work while he is a oinen. A person who is in a state of mourning, he cannot go and send his offerings. And when it comes to a person who is in a state of tum'ah, he is contaminated ritually, so depends what type of tum'ah and what type of korban. Some tum'os he won't be able to, and some tum'os he will be able to, and some korbanos as well. There is always the exception where a person will be allowed. The second chapter is the discussion is around people who are in a state of tum'ah, a ritual contamination, that they cannot enter to the temple. However, there is different types of tum'ah. There is different areas in the temple where in some of those areas there is access to tmeim from one type. And generally speaking, the Metzoyua person who is in a state of leprosy, he is the most severe one of all of them, that even to Jerusalem he cannot enter. When it comes to Zovim, when there is a discharge comes out from their body, So they are not allowed to enter to Har HaBayis as well. Tomei Meis, he will be allowed to enter to the Har HaBayis, as we have mentioned in the previous shiurim, that the original prototype comes from the times of Moshe Rabbeinu, that he was having the body of Yosef carried with him in the territory which was equivalent to the Har HaBayis. So from that on, you know that a person, if the mace itself was allowed to enter, how much more so a Tomei mace. But in reality, the Cheil, which was the internal gate inside the Har HaBayis, was the boundary for Tomei mace to enter to that. In the Ezras Noshim was no entry for a person who was Tomei, and he just went to the mikveh, but no Harev Shemesh yet, which means the sunset was not set upon him. And from Ezras Yisrael on, there is no entry even to a person who is a Mechusar Kippurim. A Mechusar Kippurim is an individual who already went through the process of Tahare. He had already Ha'arev Shemesh. The only thing that he is missing is to bring his offerings. So such an individual, though technically he will be Tohir, he's a pure man, but nevertheless, as far as entry to the temple, he is restricted to enter to Ezras Yisrael. The difference in the level of severity comes to expression in a case that they have violated and they entered to the holy areas in the temple. So while a Metzoiro that was violating and went out from his areas of entry, he will get lashes biblically. Tomei Meis, Tvul Yoim or Mechusar Kippurim, who entered there will get only Makas Mardus, which is a rabbinical punishment. But when it comes to the Ezras Yisrael, entry to the Ezras Yisrael, every Tomei will be subject biblically to a Chiyuv Kores. When it comes to Beshogeg, he was done it unknowingly, he will bring a Korban Oile V'Yored, which will depend on his budget. If he's rich, he will bring an animal. If he's poor, he will bring a bird or even a flower offering. There is talking about entry to the holiest place, not necessarily the Kodesh or Kodesh HaKodoshim. There is one exception if he entered not through a conventional entry, but he went through the roof, which is called Derech Gagois. Then, though he is not allowed to, but he will be exempt from any consequences and punishment biblically. Because when the Torah says Lo Yovoi El Hamikdash Lo Yovoi, he won't come to the Beis Hamikdash only derech bio also Torah, only through a conventional entry, but through not a conventional entry, it will be exempt. A person who found himself in a state of tumor while he is in the temple, he must leave immediately and not wait. If he has two options, he may exit through a short path, although it may take him longer because he may walk slower, or he has an option to go through a longer path, though the bottom line, as far as time, he will be able to exit quicker. Nevertheless, he must choose the shorter way. The amount that is prohibited for him to wait until he will be subject to any liability is the time that necessary for a person to fall upon the floor and recite the posuk Vayichreu apayim artzo al horitzpo vayishtachvu v'hoidos l'Hashem ki tov ki lo ilom chasdoi. I would say it's about 10 to 15 seconds based upon the speed and the ability to pronounce this pasuk. In the final chapter, the discussion is if a person who is in a state of tumo, who was working already in the temple. So first of all, the avodo, the service that he was done, is desecrated. B, he will be subject to misobedei shomayim. Though that we have learned before that about the entry itself, he already exposed to death. How can you have a second death doing the service that you shouldn't be doing? There is a possibility in the scenario when a person, he was walking out of the temple in the short way, but nevertheless he had a pipe or any form of utensil in his hand, and while he was walking out, he was turning a piece of meat, and doing so, he was not violating the staying in the temple because he was on the way out, but nevertheless, he was actually committing the crime of serving in the temple in a state of tumult. If he was serving and then after he was serving, he found out he was in a state of tumult. So depends what type of tumo, if it was a tumo yeduo, a non-tumo. So obviously the korbonos he brought will be disqualified, will be posul. There is one exception if it was a tumas hatehoim, as he defined it previously. It is such a tumo that nobody in the world had any idea about the existence. The tzitz will be a toning upon this tumo, and therefore the korbonos was nirtzum. The final chapter of the lesson 154 deals about korbonos she'ein kovua lohem zman. There is no special time designated for a korban, and therefore there is no sense of urgency. They can be brought any time. So such a korban cannot push away Shabbos and cannot push away the tumos. If a person on Shabbos, he is forbidden to bring this korban, and if a person is in a state of tumo, he is forbidden to bring this korban. If there is a kovua lohem zman, like any type of korbanos tzibur, they will be pushing the Shabbos and they will be pushing away the tumo. In fact, everybody is familiar with the story of the introduction of Korban Pesach Sheni that came about when individuals were not able to participate due to the state of tumo in the offering of the Korban Pesach, which was introduced to them the only time while they were in the desert. So, and as a result of it, God Almighty told Moshe Rabbeinu the parsha of Pesach Sheni. Since the Torah describes the condition that took place in the introduction of Pesach Sheni, Vayu anoshim asher hoyotmeim lenefesh odom, few people who were in a state of tumo, they were given the Pesach Sheni. So it comes to teach us that only anoshim, yichidim, only individuals, they are the one who are being pushed for Pesach Sheni. However, if the entire tzibur is in a state of tumo, they don't need a Pesach Sheni. They can and should bring the Pesach Rishon in a state of tumo. It is very interesting to note because today in Erev Yom Kippur, the halachos of today dealing with the idea of Pesach Sheni, as we all know, that the spiritual teaching of Pesach Sheni is the concept that nothing and never is lost, and there is always a second chance, which is the idea of tshuva. as well as we know that Erev Yom Kippur is the day when Luchos Shniyos, the concept of Luchos Shniyos, were given. But as far as we were speaking, that korban shekovua lo izman, a korban that has a specific time designated, a person should bring it in a state of tumo. It is important to notice only when it comes to a tumas mace only, and not only if the tzibur, but also if the kohanim or the kelim are in a state of tumo, they as well should be able to bring the korban in a state of tumo of dover shekovua lo izman only. At the end, the Rambam introduces a historical precedent from the period of King Yechizkiyahu, who was a big tzaddik, and he purified the land from the contamination of idol worship, which was quite popular in the times before him. And he brought the nation in a state of tshuva, and he cleaned the land from the gilulim, from the idols which were stuck to them in the previous time. And in order to enable people to bring the korban Pesach in a state of purity, he was me'aber the year, though he shouldn't. It's not a primary reason, and especially when he was me'aber the year in a day that was already ro'ui to be a part of Chodesh Nisan, which you're not allowed to be me'aber es hashono. Since his intention was to enable the people to be metaher, though in reality not all of them were able to be metaher, and at the end they brought the korban Pesach in a state of tum'o, which was according to the rule. But on the way he was committing items that they were not desired. Nevertheless, he prayed to God Almighty to atone for his wrongdoing, and God Almighty listened to his prayer. And as the Tanakh states, Vayishma Hashem el Chizkiyahu va'ir poho'om, were a great encouragement to finish this shiur with a sentence that can serve not only a conclusion of the shiur, but also a promise and a wish that God Almighty will listen to the entire Am with their prayers, and will inscribe all of us in Chasimo Toivo, Leshono Toivo Mesuko, in all aspect of Gashmius and Ruchnius, for everybody, for Klal Yisrael, and for each and every individual as well. Shono Toivo Mesuko.